Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're cutting through the noise to look at the actual mechanics of poverty. You hear the word thrown around a lot in debates, right? Well, we're going to skip the emotional buzzwords and dive straight into the hard data. We want to see exactly how economists and governments actually define, measure, and try to tackle this massive issue.
So let's just start right off the bat with a question that sounds super simple, but really isn't. What does it actually mean to be poor in our modern world? I mean, if you ask 10 people on the street, you'd probably get 10 completely different answers. Is it just an empty bank account, lacking a roof over your head, or is it something a lot deeper, something structural?
To really answer that, we have to recognize that poverty isn't just a money problem. It's multidimensional. It's basically a massive systemic barrier to human well-being. Sure, it involves lacking basic material necessities, food, water, shelter, but it goes way beyond that. It is the active denial of opportunities, the opportunity to live a tolerable life, to be healthy, to be creative, to just have a decent standard of living. It's like an invisible ceiling clamped down over human potential.
And the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, really nails this duality. They split the concept into income poverty and human poverty. Income poverty is exactly what it sounds like. You just don't have the material wealth or necessities. But human poverty? That is the denial of the opportunity itself to live a tolerable life. You can see how these two just feed right into each other, creating this vicious web that keeps people completely trapped.
Okay, so let's zoom out. We're looking at categorizing poverty through two global perspectives, because how this looks in a developing nation is vastly different from a highly developed one.
First up, we've got absolute poverty. You're mostly going to find this in developing countries. This describes a brutal situation where a segment of society literally cannot get the most basic necessities of life. They just fail to reach the bare minimum level of living needed for human survival. Governments measure this strict cutoff using the poverty line. But here is the one silver lining with absolute poverty. Because it's based on a fixed baseline of survival, completely eradicating it is actually possible if you have the right targeted economic policies.
On the flip side, we have relative poverty. This one is way more common in developed countries, and it's really all about inequality. Relative poverty hits when someone's consumption or income falls distinctively below the average for their society. It indicates the economic status of others around you, usually measured by comparing average per capita income. And because it totally relies on comparing your status to everyone else's, complete eradication? Yeah, it's considered impossible. Mathematically, there will always be an average, which means there will always be people falling below it.
Looking at this comparison, the big takeaway is the difference in standards. Absolute poverty uses a consistent standard over time. Basically, what do you need biologically to survive? Relative poverty, though, is a moving target. It changes over time because societal averages are always shifting. One is measuring raw survival, while the other is measuring societal inequality.
Now, moving forward, we're going to zero in on absolute poverty and the poverty line as a metric for survival, which brings up a fascinating, kind of grim economic problem. How do you actually put a concrete number on survival?
Well, governments use the poverty line. It's a concrete economic standard, and it's largely defined by food poverty. Basically, it's the income level that is just sufficient to buy a basic minimum quantity of food, plus a few select non-food items. What's absolutely crucial to grasp here is what this metric leaves out on purpose. The standard per capita income required for this bare minimum famously excludes things like adequate clothing, healthcare, shelter, or education. It is literally just a metric to keep you breathing.
Let's ground this in a real-world example by looking at India. Back in 1978, India's Planning Commission drew their poverty line using a strict nutritional standard. They decided that someone living in a rural area required exactly 2,400 calories a day to survive, while someone in an urban area needed 2,100 calories. Why the gap? Well, rural citizens were typically doing much heavier agricultural and physical labor, so they physically burned more energy and needed more calories just to keep going.
So, once they had those biological requirements, they had to convert calories into cash. In 1978, getting those daily calories translated to roughly 62 rupees per person per month in rural areas. For urban areas, even though the calorie count was lower, things just cost more in the city. So the urban poverty line was pushed up to about 71 rupees per month. It's a stark contrast, but it makes the underlying math really easy to follow.
Of course, the evolution of the line was inevitable. Economies aren't static. Inflation happens, prices rise, and a baseline set in the 70s obviously isn't going to hold up decades later.
You can see the timeline here.
We started with that rigid 1978 Planning Commission calorie count. But jump ahead to 2011 and 2012, and the government shifted to the recommendations of the Tendulkar Committee. They knew prices had skyrocketed over the decades, so the committee recommended bumping up the poverty line to reflect actual modern economic realities.
And once you have these updated numbers, economists calculate what's called a head count ratio. This is exactly what it sounds like. It simply counts all the people who cannot afford the minimum consumption expenditure for those basic calories. Anyone under that financial threshold is officially classified as living below the poverty line. This ratio is the definitive metric governments use to measure the sheer scale of absolute poverty in their country.
So, let's look at the numbers. Where did the Tendulkar Committee actually draw the line in 2011-2012? For rural areas, even after adjusting for decades of inflation, it was set at just 816 rupees per person per month. Just think about that. Earning below that meant you were officially in absolute poverty.
And for urban areas, factoring in the much higher costs of living in a city, that line was drawn at 1,000 rupees per person per month. It is pretty sobering to think about the absolute austerity of that single number acting as the official threshold for survival. Looking at these incredibly strict, bare minimum definitions really frames the whole concept of human well-being in a new light. Which leaves us with a final thought as we wrap up this explainer. As governments keep updating these metrics, shifting from just basic daily calories to these ever-changing financial thresholds, how does redefining the math actually change our understanding of human progress? Are we just moving the goalposts? Or are we finally starting to grasp what it genuinely takes to give every human being the chance at a tolerable life? Thanks for joining me today, and keep asking those big questions.